Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
It's so good to see you all here today. I've been asked what the link is between Africa and the course American Issues. The U.S. provides both foreign aid and resources for the World Bank and the UN. Barbara Thomas Slayter is part of that link, and she will help us look at the role of the rural woman in Sub-Saharan Africa today. Barbara spent over 10 years living in Asia and Africa and has carried out research in several countries in those regions. Her interests include local institution building, community-based resource management, and the dynamics of class, ethnicity, and gender. Barbara grew up in Washington, has a BA from Bryn Mawr, and completed her dissertation in Kenya for a PhD from Brandeis University. It was in Kenya that she first became interested in the roles, rights, and responsibilities of African women, especially in rural communities. She's currently a research professor in Clark University's Department of International Development, Community, and Environment, where she's been a faculty member for over 30 years. She's author, editor of several books, including Southern Exposure, which she will refer to today. She served on the board of directors of Oxfam America, has chaired the Fulbright selection for scholars from Africa. Having worked with Barbara in the PTA and carpooling as we raised our 3 children, I watched her develop all these coping skills that she's using and applying in her African research. I knew way back she could do it. Her title today is Exploring Issues of Food Security, Health, and Livelihoods for Rural Women in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're very pleased to have you with us today, Barbara.
Thank you, Anne. What Anne didn't mention was that we had a big connection in Girl Scouts. And that's where we really got to know each other quite well. I'm happy to be here today, and you know, I'm especially happy because thinking about this talk has given me an opportunity not to think about the election. So we're going to talk today about the issues of food security, health, and livelihoods for rural women. So I'm putting up a map of Africa so that I can show you the countries that I draw on most particularly. One of them is Kenya, and the other one is Zimbabwe. Oh my goodness, look at those hands shake. The photos that you will see are from those 2 countries. Those are not the only countries where I've worked. I've also worked for shorter periods of time in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and in Senegal, and briefly in Somalia. But my longer term research has been in Kenya and also in Zimbabwe. There are 54 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a lot of countries. I'm not dealing with that northern Islamic tier, nor thinking about South Africa particularly, which is a developed or industrialized country, but rather that middle band of countries that which have a lot of similarities to Kenya and to Zimbabwe. So who's there? Who lives there? Well, there are more than 800 million people living in Sub-Saharan Africa. And of those, most, 65%, are dependent upon agriculture for their livelihood sources. And of that group, there are 33 million small farms, small farmers. And those small farms are really averaging 1 to 5 acres. And so we're talking about truly small plots of land or small areas that people live on for getting their livelihood. What you may not know is that most of the people in Sub-Saharan Africa on those small farms who are producing the food are women. And you might wonder why. Well, one reason is that historically, men have taken care of animals and women have taken care of food crops. That's one reason. But another reason is that nowadays a lot of men are going out of the community to seek jobs, to seek employment, to bring some wages into the family. And one of the reasons that they need to do that is that the farms are so small and so poor really in terms of technology and the inputs that they need, that they're not able to produce enough food for the family for the whole year. So maybe they're short by 2 months or 4 months, and they need cash to supplement. The fact that women are involved in this way in smallholder farming is something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And the impact on food production, which has been declining in Africa over, well, really, the last 40 or 50 years, means that the cereal production, grain production, is not keeping up with demand, and with population growth. So many households are trapped in a combination of low productivity and poor nutrition, or undernutrition and poor health. In fact, 1 in 4 Africans is undernourished, and Africa imports $30 billion of food annually. So is anybody paying attention to this? Is anybody watching to see what's happening on the small farms in Africa? And I would say yes. The people are aware, agencies are aware, governments are aware, and I would identify 3 for you that are very much involved. One is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. It's an agency that started, I think, in the 1980s and has focused on developing countries, agriculture in developing countries. And their most recent poverty report for 2016 says, and you can see, special attention must be paid to the needs of women farmers to close enduring gender gaps. So that's one agency. Then another one, which is newer, that's been, I think maybe 7 or 8 years. The Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa. That's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation started that with the idea that they really wanted to bring the Green Revolution to Africa. Green Revolution in other parts of the world, dealing with rice, for instance, or wheat, has been very successful in improving production and increasing food production. But nothing has happened with crops that are grown in Africa in terms of the kinds of changes required to really amp up productivity. And that would include grains like maize or millet or sorghum or cassava or various other crops that are quite common in Africa. That alliance now involves others as well. It's not just the Rockefeller and Gates Foundations, but other governments and other agencies have become involved in that also. And the last one I would mention is NEPAD. It's the New Partnership for Africa's Development. That is an African Union agency. That is the African countries forming the African Union. And they've got 4 goals around poverty and development. And one of their goals is one of the 4 is to accelerate the empowerment of women. So there's clearly an awareness that this needs to be accomplished. In addition to those agencies and other agencies, there are a couple other things happening in rural Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And 2 of them were surprises for me, and I'm wondering if maybe they're surprises for you. And I will reveal them as we go along. They're grassroots things that are happening in rural communities. But as we get to that, the key questions I want to ask today are what are the issues surrounding the food security and health that women face. And we're talking about these smallholder women, small farms who are doing the cultivation and trying to raise their families. How do these issues or these problems affect the livelihoods and the family well-being? And then what strategies do rural women employ to reduce the risks that their families face and to increase the opportunities in regard to food and health and livelihoods? So those are the key questions that we will look at. And I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of the kind of landscape and environment that we are talking about. The areas that I've worked in and the areas that are really quite common, the landscape that's quite common throughout much of Africa is what I would call marginal lands. Lands may be good for keeping animals, but not necessarily good for growing crops, not highly fertile, green, verdant areas, but semi-arid. Semi-arid, often fragile lands where there's been a lot of erosion and where there are a lot of environmental issues for people. If you look at that picture, you can see in the background that there's some terracing that's been done. It's a common way that Africans, and this is primarily African women, who are dealing with erosion issues. You can also see them in this particular, am I standing in front of it? Can you all? Yeah. This is just a typical little village center. You get a few shops, probably a tailor, probably a tea shop where people can congregate to have tea. You can see that there's electricity coming into the village, but you can also see that there's not a paved road. And you can imagine what that would be in a rainy season. But this is a home, a more prosperous home in Western Kenya with a thatched roof, a blue door, flowers along the railing of the fence. This family is doing well. Here is a different family situation. You can see the mud and wattle housing, the walls of the house. There's 4 children, a grandmother who's taking care of them. Nobody is looking very prosperous or well, and I'm sure the mothers, I suspect there's more than one mother because the children are more or less, at least a couple of them are the same age. And they're undoubtedly out in the fields working, and she's at home taking care of children. So that gives you some idea of the general picture, the general environment is like. So I just want to enumerate for you the rural women's major responsibilities. I've said it's provisioning the household with food. Well, in this country, we provision our households with food too, but we go to the supermarket and buy it for the most part. Maybe we're lucky, we have a summer garden, but it's really not our major responsibility. But the woman in the household is responsible for providing the food, and that means for the vast majority of them, cultivating it and cultivating it themselves. And then, as with women world over, they're also responsible for caring for the children in the household. So those are, I guess, the 2 sort of broadest responsibilities. But then there's some other ones that are pretty important and can take a lot of time. And one of them is securing fodder for animals, if they have it, going out and collecting the leaves or twigs or grasses or whatever it is animals are requiring. Particularly if they're now doing zero grazing where the animals don't roam anymore but are in a stall. Another one is securing fuel wood for fires, for cooking, for whatever. That's also a woman's responsibility. And the last really significant one, from my perspective anyway, is maintaining the resource base. And that means on their own farm, they are the ones who are responsible for assuring that the fields are in as cultivable a situation as possible, or they're the ones who are worrying both individually and collectively about soil erosion on their own property and also, as you'll see in a few minutes, on common property. So maintaining the resource base is a significant responsibility for women in a rural community. So let me introduce you to 3 women so you have some idea of what they're like. Here's one, Jerry. She's about 50. She's completed primary school. look at her, you know, she's energetic, she's confident, she's lively, she's engaged. She and her husband have a 6-acre farm. He manages the coffee, she does the maize and beans. If they need to get some help for her, they could afford to do that. She's head of a women's group. She's a lively, competent woman. And you can see that she's all dressed up for the occasion and has a lovely blue dress on with a matching hat, or matching scarf, really, sort of tied around her head. Here's Nalamai. And her situation is very different. She's younger, she's 35, she has more children, she had 7 children. We'll talk about family size in a minute. She struggles on a couple of acres of land. Her husband is a casual laborer in Machakos town, not too far, but he doesn't get home often, and because it's casual labor, that means he doesn't have a regular job and regular income. So what he can send home is occasional or sporadic. They can't afford secondary school education for their children, and she's completed 3rd grade. So she's not, Wangari is completed through primary school, but she's just completed part of the way through primary school. But note something important about her, and this is the first surprise, at least it was a surprise for me. She has a cell phone. Can you see it? Oh my goodness, it looks like a necklace. Well, it's not. It's a cell phone around her neck. And this picture was taken about 2 years ago. And I just this week contacted a colleague who's Kenyan and said, all right, I'd like to know what difference what new things are happening in the rural areas that I might not be aware of. And I asked particularly about communications, and he wrote back a wonderful email. So it was all transpired quickly. And he said, in the 2 areas that I had mentioned in Kenya where I was familiar with the situation and I knew he was, he said, just about every household has a cell phone. And it's making an enormous difference. It makes a difference not only in keeping in touch with your family, which is clearly important, but you can receive money, you can pay money, you can get work done over the phone. If you happen to have a little vegetable shop or tea shop and you need something, you can order it. You can place your order by phone and make your arrangements much more easily than you could at another point in time. So I was quite taken back because I knew from about 10 years ago when I was in Senegal and working with a group there, urban, just about everybody but me had a cell phone. And I thought, gosh, this is unusual. But it turns out cell phones have really swept through Africa, and I was quite astonished to hear about that in this case. So I'm glad that Nalamai has a phone, and that her neighbors do too. And the last one, Simbasai. Simbasai is 20. She's actually from Zimbabwe. The other 2 I showed you were from Kenya. She's the 2nd child of the first wife, and let me tell you, this gets complicated. But and this man had 3 wives. But she's completed up through Form 2, which is about the equivalent of 10th grade. She doesn't want to be a farmer. She doesn't want to do that hard physical labor. She doesn't have land at the moment anyway, and she's not married. But in any case, what she would like is a job. And maybe her preference would be to go to Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe, but she'd settle for a nearby town. She'd settle for a local job. And I include her because she represents just a wave of young people in Africa who are in rural communities, who are growing up with some education and with very little economic opportunity, very little opportunity for jobs in their communities, and tremendous pressure in the cities for jobs from people coming in, as you know. Maybe these are problems many different places, but I think this bulge, or whatever they're calling it, of young people in rural Africa is critical. And you look at these agencies that I referred to earlier, they're all talking about it, and they are all worried about what can be done for those young people. So keep them in mind, these three. The more affluent woman who's kind of a leader in her community, the woman who's struggling under really marginal circumstances, and the young adult, the young woman who wants other opportunities and can't quite find her way, and it's really a difficult situation for her. It's not unheard of in this country, by the way, but there's a very large group there that are in that position. There are a lot of factors, sort of background factors, that shape the situation for farming households, and especially for the women. And I've identified 6 of them, 3 here, and I thought I would just say a couple of words about each one, or make a couple of points about each one. But first, the question of political stability or instability. I mean, obviously, if you have a farm and you've got a civil war in your country, and you've got, you know, soldiers going back and forth across your area or back again, not much cultivation is going on, and your livelihood is certainly not secure. But that's not the case for most African countries. And I thought it would be helpful to point this out, because what we hear about in this country, mostly, not exclusively, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Somali rebels or incidents of terrorism. What else? Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe, who at 95 or whatever age he is, won't give up the presidency. We hear a lot of the much more difficult situations. Rwanda, the civil war in Rwanda that was so awful some years ago. Anyway, these are the things that capture our attention, but there are many African countries which are not in the midst of chaos and strife, and don't have kleptocracies for governments, and are, you know, struggling with perhaps limited resources, and maybe people who are not adequately trained in a whole range of issues, but they're not providing the, you know, the unstable and really difficult conditions that we think of as when we think about Africa in many contexts. So that was one point I wanted to make about the political situation. I would just add a second point, that a lot of people feel policies across many African countries have favored urban areas as opposed to rural areas, and not been really even-handed on that. And I think it's a separate issue, but certainly an important one. The environmental degradation and pressure on resources, I've mentioned that before. A lot of the lands that people are farming are marginal lands. They're semi-arid. We're talking about rain-fed agriculture, not irrigated agriculture. They're fragile soils, they're eroded hillsides. There are all sorts of environmental issues. Then you get on top of that some human-made issues, and one of them is that there's a lot of fragmentation of land holdings going on. You know, originally in much of Africa, land was held communally by a group, by an ethnic group, by a tribe, whatever name one wants to use. But anyway, there was common ownership of land. But as independence came and as modernization came, privatization of land also was introduced. But again, that privatization was primarily male ownership and not female ownership. And that's certainly an important consideration in terms of women and what women have access to. Generally, it's not ownership of land. One of the things that has happened in many African countries is that land is inherited equally by all the sons. In other words, there's not primogeniture, which there was in Europe. One of my grandfathers, for instance, was about the, 8th or 9th son on a Norwegian farm. He didn't get that farm. The eldest brother did, and he came to this country. If you're a Kenyan household and you've got 4 sons, no matter what the size of that property is, you are obliged to divide that property 4 ways. And that means a lot of fragmentation is going on, and then it's harder for each family to make a living off the land, and so on. It becomes very complicated. As a result, farming size is decreasing. Let me put it differently, that there's a lot of inequality going on with small, the size of farms getting smaller as opposed to getting larger. A third point is that there's inadequate infrastructure, and that's in terms of roads. That's obviously very clear, but it's also other ways too. When I first went to Kenya, people used to say if you wanted to go to Accra in Ghana, in West Africa, by plane, you really needed to go by London because there was no direct route between Nairobi and Accra. So infrastructure has been, or is still, a major issue. The World Bank has a program for infrastructure development in Africa, and they're working on a whole range of things, ports and airports, boat ports and airports, roads, other kinds of communications to improve them in the African setting. But feeder roads, the small roads that go into villages, have also been a problem. And one of the very interesting things for me when I first went to Africa is to see that rural women took it upon themselves as a group, collectively, not individually, to work on local roads in their community. And you would say, or I would say, why are you doing this? And they would say, there isn't anyone else who's going to do it. If we want to be able to get our children out to a clinic, or if we want to be able to move more easily to the village market that's a couple miles away, we need to repair these roads. And then another question would come, well, why aren't the men doing it? Or the boys? And there would be several answers, and one of them was, a lot of the times the men weren't there. They were out looking for jobs someplace else, so they couldn't be the ones working on the local roads. But also, historically, men haven't done that work, at least not for free. And women would do it, usually as a group, and say, okay, we'll all pitch in. I don't know if it's so different other places, but and here, and even in this country, I think a lot of women have historically done a lot of volunteer work locally, regardless of what the gender breakdown on it was. But in any case, that is certainly an issue. But here comes the second surprise. Cell phones being number one, the second one being something called, in Kenya, the bodaboda. And the bodaboda is a motorcycle taxi. And apparently, these are becoming widespread in many African countries. I looked it up on the web because I didn't even know about this until I got this email from this colleague in Kenya. I know about motorcycles, obviously, but there haven't been a lot of them in Africa. Much more bicycle traffic, at least the places that I've been. But now, apparently, they are one of the hottest items going, and it's to use as a taxi. It's the African version of Uber. And these women who now have the cell phones are able to request that 70-pound bag of fertilizer, and they're not carrying it on their heads, as I've seen girls in Nepal do. But the bodaboda can take it. And furthermore, the guy who has the bodaboda also has a cell phone. So you can call him and you can say, would you go to such and such a place and pick up that 70-pound bag of fertilizer and bring it to me? And it's happening. So now I'm hoping that Nalamai, the woman I showed you, who's got the cell phone but is not prospering really, I'm hoping that she's saving a little money somewhere and that she's got a son and she can subsidize him to put money down on a bodaboda, and he can get to work in one of those coveted jobs in a rural community that young people need. We shall see. But in any case, that's the end of the surprises, the cell phone and the bodaboda that are in other places as well. Now you might ask me why I should say anything at all about HIV/AIDS, and don't we know enough about that already? It has been important in Sub-Saharan Africa, and it does affect rural households. And let me just briefly say why. First of all, Sub-Saharan Africa has 15% of the world's population, but 70% of HIV, AIDS cases and deaths. So, there's a real imbalance there. For a while, as you know, the situation was desperate. It was awful, but it is getting better. And the number of new cases and the number of deaths from AIDS has declined dramatically. And this is partly because of the availability of medications, and partly also because there's been a tremendous effort in some countries with education, Uganda having, I think, led the way on that. So the situation insofar as AIDS goes has definitely improved, but it's left some impacts that are long-lasting. And I would say two of them have affected rural households in particular. One is orphaned children. They need a home, relatives will take them in, but sometimes if the children are moving along into teenage years, they'll try to sustain the household. But it's been a real problem. And I've had colleagues in Africa who have relatives who've taken in this person or that person, or this child or that child. So it's hit a lot of people. It's hit the responsibility has come for a lot of people. But the other thing that's happened is it's cut back the labor supply. If you are dependent on agriculture, and you need to be out there working in the fields and cultivating and weeding and planting and getting your harvest in, and somebody is sick and dying, or if you've lost people, your labor supply is diminished. And that has definitely made a difference in terms of the rural households. And on population and demographics, let me just say a couple of words. Everybody in this country worries a lot about population growth, and they'll look particularly at Africa and say, oh, my goodness, what's happening there? Population growth is declining in Africa, partly as health improves, partly, well, for a whole variety of reasons. But I think the average family size is now about 5. Remember when I first went and was working in some rural communities in Western Kenya, I just remember so clearly 2 households I visited where each of the women one had born 17 children, of whom I think 15 had died early. Many in the first year, but also up to about 3. There's a lot of infant mortality. And the other one had figures somewhat similar. That's changing. Things are definitely improving in that area. You might also ask why anyway people have so many children. If you're a small farmer in a poor country and you're poor, the marginal cost of an additional child is not great. And the benefit that child can bring in terms of added labor pool in the household, someone else to go get the water, someone else to go get some fuel wood, that's pretty important. And the opportunity that child might provide, or a child might provide, by perhaps getting an education, perhaps getting a job, perhaps helping the whole family, that's a pretty big opportunity. So small cost, big opportunity, and people tend to have children. The other population demographic factor that I think is really important, and I've mentioned that before, is the outmigration. The outmigration primarily of men to get jobs elsewhere and leaving women behind to deal with the farm situation. And finally, I would add in infectious diseases. There are tremendous costs to children and also to all households, really, in terms of diseases that we, as a world community, still don't have a handle on. Malaria is one of them. A lot of people get malaria, and then malaria is recurring. That is, you may get rid of it, but you may also get it again. It kind of lives within your system and can recur. So That's one of them. But there are a lot of respiratory diseases and diarrheal diseases related to things that, something could be done about. Right now, today, something like 50% of the people in rural Kenya have access to clean water. And that's an improvement. But 50% of the people do not. And unless they're boiling the water or being very, very careful, and some are, the likelihood of some of these diseases, getting some of these diseases, is just there. That's for sure. So, and then some of them also, you get one, you get another. TB and AIDS tend to be, I don't know, what do they call them, co-coordinate or co-something diseases. So they can turn up and cause a lot of difficulties. So these are some of the challenges that women face. And I want to talk a bit about how they've responded to these challenges. What do they do? And I'm not talking about what they do with AGRA or NEPAD or other agencies coming in, because that's another ballgame. But what have they done themselves to deal with their situations? And I've listed here 4 things that they do, and then I'll talk about each of them separately. But the first one is to pursue multiple sources of support. That is, diversifying their sources of livelihood. A second one is to engage in group income-generating activities. A third is to build common property and community services. And the fourth is participating in revolving loan associations. So first, pursuing multiple sources of support. That's individually and for the household. Well, first, we've talked about cultivating maize and beans or other grains, cowpeas, whatever. They do a lot in that area. But they also will have a small vegetable garden, and they'll sell vegetable produce when they can at a local village market. And also fruits. You'll see women with, with big, what do we call them, things of bananas on the roadside or in a village market. The bananas are ripe, they're taking them to sell, or papayas, or other kinds of fruits. They'll also collect and sell firewood, work as an agricultural laborer if they can get work on somebody else's farm who might need some help. Acquiring a cow, and particularly a grade cow, is a good way to get some extra income. There are indigenous cows and there are grade cows, which are imported, and they're hybrid or crossbreeds. The indigenous cows don't produce much milk, but if they can get a grade cow or get a crossbreed, they're able to increase milk production and then sell part of it, get some income that way. So people are resourceful. These women are not lazy, and they are resourceful. And for the most part, they're out there really, really hustling. And the other thing that I would add is that they do various kinds of handicrafts. They make baskets, or pottery, or even maybe get together to make bricks for construction purposes. So there are a lot of different things that they do to diversify their sources of income. I have just a couple of photos that I'll show you. This is a woman who's been working on her own field, or the household's coffee, and she herself, over time, dug that trench, that bench terrace, the purpose of which is obviously erosion control, to keep the water. Water is such an issue, such a problem. It's scarce. They just do everything they can to keep it. To me, she looks so hardworking and so tired, and she's just stuck in my mind for several years about how hard she worked and what a challenge it was. Here's a younger woman who's winnowing, and that's not as difficult, but she's still, the tasks are endless, I think, as anybody who's grown up in an agricultural household, which I haven't, but they would know. This woman, and I'm sorry you can't see it with a little bit more brightly, but this is one of my favorites, because this is someone, the quintessential multitasking woman. Now she's, I think, just coming back from market. She has an empty bag on her back, so I think she took some fruits or something to market that she was selling. And on the way back, she's collecting wood to take home to use. And while she's doing that, she's making a basket. and she can make about 2 baskets a week if she keeps at it and sell them. And there are ways that I'll talk about in a minute that they do that. Anyway, I love this woman. I think she's quite terrific. And here's another woman who's taking some papaya off to market. Now, don't you think she'd be happy to have a boda-boda? Or a son who had a boda-boda who could take the papaya to market for her? I think that'd be really great. So maybe change is coming. So then the next thing I mentioned that they do is to engage in group income generating activities. And basically, if you look at it in terms of economics, they're just fiddling with the factors of production, their productive assets. They've got land, labor, and capital. Land, for the most part, is pretty limited. Capital is very limited. But they do have labor, and they can adjust how they work on their own fields or with each other. So typically, these women would form into groups of maybe 25 or 30 people, and they would generally know each other pretty well, and it would be across different ages within the community. And again, a typical group might decide they're going to work 2 days a week, long mornings, let's just say, 4 or 5 hours. And they would work one of those days of the week on each other's property, on each other's farm, and do whatever that person wanted to have done. If it's bench terraces, that's what they do that day, or if it's planting or weeding or whatever, that the householder, the woman whose farm it is, has the benefit of a group of laborers to get a big job done. Then the other day, they would do something else. Now, if there's a larger property owner in the area, and remember, 20% of the farms are not small. So they're positive. I know in one of the areas I worked in, there was a member of parliament who had a big farm. And if they might go as a team of workers and work on that farm and be paid, and then each woman, they would just divide up the proceeds that they'd gotten from that day. So that would be one thing they would do with their common work day. And then the other thing they would do would be to work on some of the community projects together. This method of sort of reallocating their labor and figuring out new ways to get the benefit of labor is kind of an adaptive mechanism for them. They're not just on their own little farm, but they're actually finding ways to work together to help one another and increase the assets to which they have access, which is, I think, important. Also, just psychologically or socially, these groups make a difference to women who are kind of managing alone. You've got a network, a support structure, and they are important to each other, I think, for that reason. Just a couple of pictures. This is in Zimbabwe. And again, it's these semi-arid lands where, unless they can get water, they do not get a second crop out of the year because of the absence of rain. But there was a river nearby, and they had been cultivating near the river, or near rivers. It's not just this particular river. And the government of Zimbabwe had put out a regulation that farmers were not allowed to cultivate within 30 meters, about 90 feet of a river, because the rivers were eroding badly. And furthermore, that they needed to do so in groups. So one of the results was that these women's groups organized themselves to have community farms, I should say, plots, not farms, but plots, within 90 feet of a river. And this woman, with her baby on her back, is getting the ground ready to plant. I'm hoping you can see it a little better in this one. You can see that they have individual small plots within a protected area. So she's got a couple of areas there that she'll be working on. She's got some seedlings that are coming up. And then if you look in the background, you'll see a thorn fence. And that thorn fence is serious business. And it's to keep out two predators that will go after the vegetables. And one of them, I'm sure you could probably guess, is monkeys, but the other one I never would have thought of, hippos. Hippos come out of the rivers at night and they'll eat your vegetables that are nearby. So you need to do something to keep the hippos out. I was quite amazed at that one. And here's just a group of women who are clearly identified with each other. They've gotten T-shirts that all say, this is Kafeka Women's Group or something like that. And obviously proud out of that. Okay, the third thing that they do, and I alluded to this some, is to build common property and community services. One of the really important ones is to improve points of water access, springs and wells. If you can protect those, you can keep the mosquitoes out, and you've kept one, you reduced one place where mosquitoes can breed, and therefore perhaps kept malaria or other mosquito-borne diseases down. They also work a lot on schools. So, a work day will be called, and they'll come and help improve walls or whatever is happening with a school or a clinic. They'll often build nursery schools. Nursery schools are not provided ever. Elementary schools are technically, but nursery schools are not. And they will construct a nursery school and figure out a way to get a teacher involved. I mentioned the feeder roads that they will work on, and what I just need to be really clear about, because it's so important, is how much work they do in terms of the environment. The bench terracing you saw, where they built dug this ditch, and the hillside, some hillsides will be covered with those ditches in parallel form to prevent erosion. But they also put in gabions, the stone and wire mesh controls, barriers for a stream or a river to keep the water, to hold the water back, or check dams at various points to keep water from just running right down and off and being carried away. They do a lot of that kind of work and do it, from what I can see, reasonably willingly and are glad with the results. I've got a couple of pictures that show different kinds of community efforts. This is a woman in Zimbabwe at a school, where the school has a sizable garden that's managed by both students and women in the area. And she's carrying water on her head to water the vegetables. And here is a student who's doing the same thing with a bucket and a homemade sprinkling can from what looks like a milk container, maybe. In any case, taking care of the onions. So that's schools. That's one kind of project that they do. Here is a woman working the water pump in a building that's been constructed to protect that pump. And this was paid for and put in by women. Women didn't necessarily do all the work on that, and obviously they didn't construct the pump, but they made it happen, put it that way. And here are women getting water from this particular water pump. Now, wouldn't you think that they might be glad to have a son with a boda who could take that water home for them, and they wouldn't have to carry it? And last, just a couple of two pictures on the construction work they do on the roads or the bench terraces in a group format. There's a group of women out for the morning working, and if I had a video with sound, they'd probably be singing and keeping themselves motivated by doing that. The last thing they do that I'm going to talk about is establish revolving loan associations. This is something that I think happens world over in poor communities. People, particularly women, I think, arrange whereby everybody gives a monthly contribution, and then they are given out in turn to members of the group. The really important thing about this is that this woman's money is someplace else. It's not sitting in the kitchen in a jar, waiting for her teenage son or daughter to come and say, you know, Mom, could I have $10 to go to a movie or get a pizza? or for the husband wanting to borrow it for something that he wants. This money is protected, it's off with the group, and when her turn comes, she gets it. It's a big sum, and she can do what she wants to do with it. Well, that's not completely true. Sometimes they have rounds that if you are get in a certain round, maybe you're supposed to spend that money on a water tank, or maybe you're supposed to spend it on iron sheets for the roof or the new cow, or, you know, whatever it is. Sometimes it's a round that's designated, sometimes it's just you do whatever you want with the money that comes your way, but that's important for them. This is a woman whose name is Grace Ngee. She was such a venerable member of this community and head of one of the women's group. I just had to include her. Very remarkable, bright, dedicated, and hardworking person. So to summarize, I think a couple of things are obvious. One is that these women in these smallholder households are really concerned about practical problems and practical details. They want to know where the food is coming from. They've got to get it. They're worried about their children. They're worried about the health of the children. They're worried about school fees and housing, their home. They are increasingly having a sense of what the important underlying factors are. Land ownership. If if a house isn't in your name or a property isn't in your name, it can be taken away from you. And many is the situation, certainly in Kenya, where if a husband passes away, the husband's brothers feel that they have the right to that land, and they can swoop in mighty fast and kick the woman out and maybe keep the children, maybe not. But they feel that's their patrilineal right, and that's really can be extremely hard on the woman. That ties in with inheritance laws as well. And just finally, I think the political consciousness that goes with this is coming, but it's not quite there yet. So, what do women like Wangari and Nalamai and Simbusai need? Well, they certainly need to have their roles as farmers strengthened, and also their roles as citizens, the ways they can exercise more advocacy and authority for themselves. I personally think secondary school education is very valuable for everybody, but girls aren't as likely to get it as boys. A lot of countries are, I'm not talking about African countries, but I'm thinking more of Asian, have developed incentives to keep girls in school, even financial incentives, but certain incentives for a family to make sure that girls get a secondary education. I think that could be valuable. Obviously, work of an organization like AGRA, where they're thinking about the technology and improvements, the green revolution, the getting what's needed out to small farmers is very important. We talked about jobs, and jobs in rural communities, jobs for these kids who are growing up without seeing much promise on the horizon. And then finally, I would say support through organizations. And I mentioned 4 organizations here, and you may know of at least 2 of them, maybe one more because I've been talking about it. Kiva is an international organization that provides small loans to entrepreneurs in poor countries. It's any one of us could look up Kiva on the internet right now and pick out a country in which we would like to put $50, pick out an entrepreneur, male or female, pick out a kind of work, poultry, small shop, barber shop, I don't know, whatever they are, something that person would benefit from some small investment, and target that person, target the investment to that person, target your gift to that person. And it's one of those, the gift that keeps on giving, because then when they pay that loan back, that loan is given to someone else. It's a great way to do our own little bit, I think. I mentioned Kenya's roots. Roots, it's not just in Kenya, but it's grassroots, and the acronym stands for grassroots. It's an umbrella organization in which there are about 2,000 in Kenya, small community groups involved. And groups, it's for women actually, not there's just women's groups, but it's working very hard on advocacy issues, on capability training, on matters like inheritance rights for women. So that organization is something that I think is doing really valuable work. And then last one I mentioned is Oxfam America. As Ann said, I've been involved with Oxfam America, was on the board for a number of years and still contribute. And they do a lot of really good work with small farmers in Africa, and they also do a lot of good work with women around the world. So I certainly endorse their activities. And now, who would have thought? Cell phones and motorbikes, boda boda. The combination of these two technologies is fast transforming the country in a way nobody would have predicted 5 years ago, and rural women are the biggest beneficiaries. And this is the comment in the email I received from Frances Lalo, who is the Vice Chancellor at Laikipia University, and just, not this summer, but the summer before, got an honorary doctorate at Clark, where he also got his PhD in the Graduate School of Geography. And just so you would know what this is like, can you see those boda bodas? I think it's animal skins on the top one, lots of, a family on the one to the left at the bottom. I don't know what those are, rolled up mattresses maybe, on the right. And then a cell phone. That isn't a Kenyan cell phone, but I thought it was colorful. So thank you. And if you have questions or comments or observations from other countries, I would be really interested in hearing them, and I hope others would be too.
Almost all the poor nations have a problem with population growth. All the wealthy nations of the world, virtually without exception, do not have growing populations. So it seems to us that this treadmill that countries like Africa are on in terms of more and more people is never going to end until their population growth comes to an end. I know that in the case of China's rapid rise in the world, much of that's attributed to China's one-child policy, and the nation was able to make a giant leap forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, your observations about China are certainly accurate, and about the West now having very low population growth. But that's occurred over time. I think when we were a primarily rural country, we didn't have that situation. And I think if you or I were to think back a generation or maybe 2 generations ago of the size of the families of your great-grandparents or your grandparents, they were big. And they were big because they were rural and farm and needed that help, and also because they didn't have access to population or contraception. But my own view is that population growth rates are coming down. And they're coming down because of several factors. The health is one of them. And people can be more assured that children will grow up. And you're not playing the odds against losing half of your family before they reach age 3. That's sobering from my point of view. And as people become more urban, as they become educated, and a child becomes more costly. If you're sending a child to school, we all know if you're sending them to college, there are costs that the extra child imposes upon the family. And I think that these are factors that contribute to the decline. My hunch is that within another generation, that those African households will be coming down substantially in terms of size. Hope I'm right.
I wondered if you would share a view about water quality in Africa. It seemed that this was such an issue in terms of sickness and accessibility, and do you feel that that's really improving?
I think it is improving, and there's some organizations in the States which are working on water quality in Africa too, NGOs that are, I think, doing very good work. I can't tell you the name right now, but I know there are a couple of them. When I first was working in Western Kenya, there was a river outside of Kisii, Kisii. And that river was so polluted, and people downstream were getting their water out of that river, and they were drinking that water, and they were getting sick, and people were having trouble putting two and two together as to why they were sick. Same goes for unprotected wells or unprotected springs. You can't just let any kind of contamination come in, including bugs like mosquitoes. You really have to protect them, and that is getting much better. But a lot of people live in very remote places where it's more difficult to, educate and introduce changes and so on. So it takes time. But I think if we were to compare the rates of improvement on water quality in a variety of countries now versus 10 or 20 years ago, we would see that it's substantially improved. Still not where it should be, still bad. And of course, they might have their Flint, Michigans too. So,
all right, just one more question.
There's so many NGOs in Africa and so many charitable groups that want to either adopt villages or work with the people. Is there any coordination of all that activity to make sure that the money is going where it's supposed to go and that there's no duplication and that, are you working with the Department of Education? How does that work?
I don't think there is any overall coordination, but I do think, and you're going to some of you in here are going to have to help me out. There is online, you can, for any organization, you can go look up its rating in terms of spending ratios and the validity of their reporting efforts and a whole lot of things. What is that? Yes, thank you. Oh, you know already? And do you use it? And what do you think of it?
It's good, but it doesn't answer my question in terms of all of these NGOs and multiple efforts and whether there is any kind of...
I don't think there is. I don't think there is. In fact, I suppose to some extent they're competitive. But I think if you go to Charity Navigator and look up one or two organizations, you can decide which one you would rather give to. But I don't think there is. Though, we're talking about a large continent in terms of Africa. We're talking about lots of people who are in need and lots of opportunities to help. But your point is still valid. I don't think there's an overarching.
Well, we've got to end, but thank you so much for sharing your expertise and knowledge.